Good evening, and welcome to Screentone Club, episode 48, being recorded on the 12th of April 2020 for release on the 14th of April 2020. My name is Elliot Page. I am already sick of Easter eggs, and I am not going to touch another one for another 9 months, I suppose. And joining me as always is Mr. Andy Hanley. How you doing, Andy?
I am not sick of Easter eggs, I'm just sick of eggs in general, because I'm now living entirely on Animal Crossing time, and today is Bunny Day, and Bunny Day can get into the ocean, because I'm fed up of seeing eggs for everything. So yeah, like that's, my entire timeline is now based around what is happening in Animal Crossing.
Well, fair. Yeah, I've heard about the Bunny Day thing, and it seems almost mean for them to spring a special event into people's games when they're just getting into the core loops of it, and also the stuff that people know and love, like fossils and stuff. So, I don't know, I don't get it. It's weird. I don't know, I've been playing Assassin's Creed where I've just been running around forever. Press triangle to murder, I suppose.
I mean, Animal Crossing is also just running around forever. It's just you, like, press a button to pick up a thing rather than murder. I've tried to find the murder button in Animal Crossing. I have needed it from time to time, but sadly I've not yet found it. So if anybody has a link to the FAQ as to where the murder button is, I would be very interested to hear from you.
I think instead of the murder button, they instead have a give trendy clothes button.
Yeah. I mean, I have made some of my villagers wear ridiculous things, which I guess is kind of a murder in its own sense.
I've loved the pictures on Twitter of people putting up like QR codes of really fancy outfits inspired by anime and manga, and some of that stuff I look at and go, damn, that took a long time, I bet. But it looks cool. It's like, oh, you could totally just put all of Aikatsu into this thing. Weird.
Yeah. I mean, my island's flag is the Nerve logo, and its theme tune is Cruel Angel's Thesis, so I've somewhat delved down that rabbit hole myself.
Oh, God. Okay, fucking Tokyo 3 Island version or something. Okay, so this is your fortnightly look at manga. We kind of skipped last week and put out a special episode about Manga Plus. We'll have another one of those coming out for you shortly, but we're back to our normal schedule where we tell you about what we're going to be reading ahead of time. You can support us on Patreon if you like what we're doing. Please consider doing so. For the duration of lockdown, we're doing 2 bonus episodes a month, just because, hell, why not? We're all stuck as well. From just $1 a month, you can get bonus episodes, and from $3 a month, you can vote on what we should be covering in these bonus episodes. If you are a patron, please consider voting. It's better to have a wide pool of votes to pluck from. Especially now we're taking 2 of them a month. As always, shout-outs to Mr. Rob Jessup, who is on our shout-outs tier. Thank you very much, as always, Rob. Starting off, we have our returning champions. Do you want to go first, Andy? I'm more curious to hear about your returning champion, honestly. I'm very keen to hear from you about this.
Yes, I don't actually have a huge amount to say about it, to be honest, but as it finally finished and wrapped up earlier this month, I figured I'd return to Blue Flag, which is a series that we talked about a little while ago on the podcast. Having talked about Manga Plus, like, it is a series that is available there, although unfortunately they've excised all the middle chapters from it, which is the usual. It's gonna move to physical volumes in English at some point, I guess. So they've pulled out a bunch of content. So unfortunately, if you weren't caught up to a certain point, then you're kind of out of luck at this stage. But this is a series that I really liked and kind of glommed onto back when we originally talked about it. I ended up kind of like burning through all of it at the time, and then keeping up on it on a semi-regular basis. Because it's a really good, strong kind of drama series. It has some interesting kind of takes on his characters, on sexuality, etc., etc. And that stuff, the sexuality stuff in particular, really kind of comes to the fore in sort of the late game of the series, as it were. It very much kind of becomes focused on the relationship between 2 of the male characters who kind of, they're best friends, but then it's clear that one of them has deeper feelings than that, and, a lot of problems spiral out from that, and things get pretty fraught. I think it handles all of that stuff pretty well for the most part. Like, it continues to be engaging, like, its characters continue to be interesting throughout. I've not seen too many kind of takes on, like, the final chapters, but the ones I have seen have been a kind of like, with a sort of like, a kind of bent of I'm not sure what to think about it. And I think the reason for that is that basically the final chapters give you a big old time skip. So it kind of skips forward into sort of these characters as adults and kind of shows you where they're at with a really interesting final chapter that is done from like a first person perspective, which is kind of cool in a weird sort of way.
The Flowers of Evil treatment, perhaps.
Yeah, there's kind of a little bit of that to it, but I actually really appreciated the way it wrapped up because it gave you a chance to kind of look at the characters and in a way I wish there's a little bit more about some of them and kind of how they ended up where they did, but you kind of get to see, you know, most of the main players kind of, you know, in a sort of comfortable state effectively as adults. And it kind of works quite well because it's sort of a reminder that like, hey, for all the drama and turmoil that happens when you're at school and at high school, like it's important at the time and it's kind of important in terms of like informing who you become and kind of the life lessons you learned, but like it isn't necessarily quite so important in terms of kind of the relationships that you make, you know, that kind of stuff doesn't, most like 9 times out of 10 that kind of stuff doesn't stick around and you move on and meet other people once you're kind of outside of that environment, and it kind of goes down that angle a little bit. But yeah, it's a good solid series. Like I feel like it's very much an unpolished diamond in a lot of ways. Like it's definitely a series, and you know, I think we did this when we talked about it previously. It's a series that you can pull apart and you can kind of note the things that it kind of doesn't do as well as it should, or the missteps that it makes, etc., etc. Like it's definitely a series with flaws, but I think the general kind of vibe of that series and like where its heart is at is absolutely kind of in a good place, and it's a really good read as a result of that. Like it has a really strong likable cast who you quickly become invested in, and kind of watching that story unfold and the directions that it takes all kind of sits together really well. So I think as a whole, like I definitely enjoy that series a lot. It's definitely something that I would recommend to people if they're kind of a fan of the kind of romantic drama kind of genre. And like I hope that sooner rather than later it kind of it comes out in a form where people can read all of it from the get-go now, because as mentioned now a bunch of that content's been removed from Manga Plus. It's kind of in a bit of a weird place in terms of recommendations.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially on the recommendation front. Like, I think that it was shortly after we did the episode that I had people messaging me saying, hey, it's gone. And yeah, like with the announcement of a physical version, just huge swaths of it got just airlifted out of the Manga Plus service, which is, I'd say, kind of a shame because, like, I feel like we maybe were in the middle of a wave of people discovering it and also giving Manga Plus a shot. And then when something that was quite, you know, I'd definitely say to go check it out, vanished off of it. It was a case of, oh, bugger. Like, and this isn't out for ages. It was a typical problem of, ink's dry on the contract, time to pull the content. And it's like, well, no, because no one's going to see this for a year plus. Like, that's rude. Which is always one of these things I feel that kind of happens, especially with manga availability, where people go, well, that sucks. And they're like, no, it's the contract. And, you know, it's very hard for people to appreciate that. But also at the same time, why should you have to appreciate it? Anyway, it's a whole thing. But no, I'll admit, I'll agree with you definitely that I read of that series before it vanished. I did love, and I like the characters, especially as you say. It's not so much I'm worried about the ending. It's more the fact that, like, even when reading it, like, its ideas and its characters were great, like A+, but the execution kind of fell a bit flat and felt a bit sort of unsure of itself or unwilling to commit. And it was that sort of thing that kind of not dragged it down, but just made it seem a bit flaccid in the end. It didn't quite have the clarity of vision and execution that something like Our Dreams at Dusk did, which admittedly is kind of a very high target given how good that series is. But Blue Flag, definitely, I definitely wouldn't, I wouldn't ding it for lack of heart at the least, because I always felt that series definitely had everything on full display. Like, it was definitely going for it. It had something to tell you and was going to do it. So yeah, yes. I'm curious to see it come out physically and see what the reception is, and also frankly catch up on it, because as you say, with a lot of it vanishing, I have a huge gap of knowledge in where that series is.
Yeah, and I think if there's one thing I would say for it, I think in terms of how it moves forward into its later stages, I think it does find a certain confidence in its voice, and it kind of it stops kind of dancing around issues. It becomes a much more direct series, kind of out of necessity, I think. But like, there's definitely a point in that series where it stops kind of nudging and hinting at things, and it very much gets down to brass tacks of like, okay, here's what's going down here. And I think that is probably one. Again, it still has its flaws, and it maybe doesn't execute on all of that stuff like perfectly, but it certainly it doesn't mess around at some point, and it really kind of just goes down the direction that it's chosen for itself. And like, I think all of that stuff is super interesting as a result of that.
Yeah, cool. But yeah, I'm curious to see it. I'm hoping when it gets when it gets a release, I hope it gets a good airing. People give it a chance. So yeah, that sounds good. Blue Flag. Check it, I suppose. My returning champion, is, Hina Change, which we talked about just last episode on the Manga Plus episode, where we kind of chewed it over and kind of, it was certainly a series that would not leave you indifferent, I suppose. There's a lot there. It's the body swapping, romantic drama. I was about to say comedy, but it really isn't that comedic, let's face it. But I've read up to what is available on Manga Plus. I think it's coming out monthly. And it's up to like chapter 20 at the moment. And yeah, it's kind of like, at the risk of repeating myself, you can kind of assume that it's everything we said in that review and more so. Like, characters continue to put themselves in unhealthy situations and pick the like selfish or very self-destructive way out, especially in the case of Hina herself as a character. Some people find out about their ability, and that ends. And if one thing I'll say about that is that it reliably has people kind of collapsing or just like having a hard time dealing with it, mostly because, like, it's got that combination of teenage years, teenage romance, everything is the end of the world, everything is like now and here and forever, but also it's the sort of thing you look back on and go, Jesus, and that's kind of it. Whereas with this series, it has the extra angle of the body swapping and just personality defect and trauma element to it, which really ramps it up. And it's really wild because it has multiple sections where characters are called out on their shit, either in the series or kind of through how they're displayed. But it still continues with the characters being extremely flawed and terrible people in some regards. Again, as mentioned in the actual review, the Manga Plus comments continue to be pure gold of people just like having none of it, as it were. It's wild, actually, watching people read it and go, what? Which honestly, like, I would read a chapter and go, man, that's wild. And I'd read the comments and go, yeah, I'm with you guys. Like, that sounds bananas. So yeah, it continues, and it goes to some really miserable places. But at the same time, it's not like I've often complained about series that get spiteful because I feel like they're just torturing characters for their own pleasure and hopefully yours as the reader, but it never works on me. And this series kind of goes around that and doesn't really dive into it, mostly because no one really gets away with anything, which really helps. But also it's a case where the characters, like, they are a work in progress. It's not they're being spiteful because they're being spiteful. They're working through stuff and they're not good at it. So continues to be interesting. I have no idea where it's going. Again, like, it's a case where I finished that chapter and a load of stuff has happened, but no idea what's going to happen next, which, if anything, is still making it interesting. So yeah, that's more of Hina Change. I don't know if you wanted to carry on with it, Andy, or if you're happy to leave me to kind of dive face first. Yeah,
I mean, I find myself kind of... I find myself tempted to do it for exactly the reason you've just outlined. That whole, like, where is this going to go? Like, there is something compelling about that as a kind of, as a draw to want to read more for all of the stuff that I dislike or feel uncomfortable about it. It is that kind of almost salacious, like, yeah, but I want to see what they do. Like, where is this ultimately headed? And so my sensible choice would just be to let you be the canary in the coal mine and tell me. But, like, there's also part of me that kind of wants to experience that for myself. So I don't know whether I'll go back to it or not, but I do find a little bit of temptation to do so out of pure curiosity.
Yeah, the main thing I'll say is that, like, it knows, the one thing that helps it a lot is that it knows things are terrible, and the characters aren't just like single-minded. They will have moments of lucidity and be like, oh, this is all terrible, I need to fix this. And then typically they end up making it worse because they're an anxious, emotion-filled teen and they can't really figure themselves out of a paper bag half the time. it's also like, as you might expect, like some of the more innocent characters get hurt in the crossfire of the whole thing. And that was a horrible chapter. But the one, as I say, it doesn't sugarcoat it and also doesn't like revel in it. It's a case of like, this is the natural outcome of all this crap. And here's hoping they learn from it. Let's find out. So yeah, stuff continues. Wild ass series. If anything, I'm also glad it's available and releasing like frequently so I can keep an eye on it. But yeah, at the same time, like, to go back to my review previously, but would I buy it? Maybe not, because it's so up in the air of how it might handle itself. It could like do a lot of terrible stuff towards the end and just scupper itself, but we'll see. It's definitely a fascinating read.
Yeah, and that is the other fascinating thing with it being on Manga Plus, is because, like, definitely if it was coming out in volumes or anything like that, I would probably almost certainly be like, no, I'm fine with what I've read of it, but because it's there for free, it's like, the barrier to entry is so much lower of like, well, what's the worst that could happen? Like, I could lose like another hour of my time to this and end up disappointed. Like, there are worse things.
Yeah, I mean, there are things that you read and you think you feel cheated even if it was free because you've wasted your time, and time is still a very limited resource, so very important to make sure you get your like hours worth or whatever. But yeah, that was an interesting read to catch up on, so that's more Manga Plus, as it turns out. So, moving on to the main part of the show, what our picks for this episode are. Do you mind if I take point, Andy?
No, go for it. I'm prepared like a coiled spring for this one.
Or a coiled snake, I suppose, maybe. So yeah, this took me a while to read. So this is actually why the episode's delayed, because I kept crying off of finishing this because it took me a long time. But my pick was the light novel of My Youth Romantic Comedy is Wrong as I Expected. Volume 1, the light novel version. There is a comic version. Also known as My Teen Romantic Comedy Snafu, I believe, was what the anime was released at when it came out. I kind of picked this because apparently it's ending in Japan somewhat soonish. I know some people who are fans of this series, and was kind of just curious, given the sort of hubbub. Right. The author is Wataru Watari. It might be a pseudonym. They seem to have a lot of that, of like same syllable first name, last name stuff. Either that or they're really weird at making names. The artist for the light novel sort of illustrations is Pokan8. Again, probably a pseudonym. Published by Yen Press. The series is currently incomplete in both Japan and in English, but the Japanese series will apparently have the last volume somewhat soon. It's 9 volumes long in English, and in Japan it's 14 like primary volumes and 3 side story volumes. I think there's also 1 side story volume out in English. But we looked at the first one, the first volume, which kind of sets out the stall. And so, synopsis. It is about a character called Hachiman Hikigaya, who I'm going to call 80 from here on out because Hachiman, and I can't be asked pronouncing his name every time. And he is a singularly unpleasant prick, who thinks he's king hot shit of Hot Shit Mountain. He's in the second year of high school, and it kind of works where he thinks he's got everything sussed. He thinks he has society pegged. He thinks he's a strong loner. He thinks he's perfectly fine. He can bear everything on the chin, and he's figured it all out. He knows what he's doing. Yada, yada, yada. Opens with him getting yelled at by a teacher who weirdly gets dumped on an awful lot in this series, who I can't remember the name of. And the teacher basically says, "You're a fuck up. What the fuck? You're going to go join this after school club because you're a loser who runs home after school." And he gets taken to an outbuilding where he gets introduced to the service club. And the only other person in the service club is the untouchable ice princess of the year, Yukino. I forgot to write down her surname.
Yukino Yukinoshita.
Thank you. Yes, I should have gathered because of the UU thing. But Yukino Yukinoshita, who initially has a slightly charitable introduction of being like very pretty, a bit quiet, likes reading books. But it turns out she also has a massive run up her ass and has closed herself off initially because she being very pretty. A lot of boys confessed to her, and that pissed off girls who liked them or their or their girlfriends, so she kind of got ostracized as a reason. But she then twisted that around into a very twisted, insular, self-important, selfish personality. And so after a bit of weird banter, they end up kind of falling into this weird service club, like sort of arsehole Sket dance, I suppose, where people will be sent by the teacher to their club and they will generally be pricks and quote unquote fix their problems. Although typically so far, all it's really done is acquire them more idiots, who hang around, like the guy who is still affected by Chunibyo syndrome, or I think M8 syndrome as it's known in this series, as the translation is done. And it also coins another syndrome, which is 80's problem, which is head swell syndrome, because he, as mentioned, he thinks he's got it all sorted. And like, I suppose the idea behind the series is to have it be this very, very slow kind of addition of these useless pricks all finding friendship amongst each other, even though they're kind of individually either singularly unpleasant or emotionally broken or just in need of a bit of a sit down. And the main problem I had with it, flat out, is just that the main character, Hachiman, is such an unholy arsehole, but also you're stuck in his point of view for the entire thing. You do get some flashes of a character's point of view, but he's such an unpleasant character to sit with. Like, he feels like Monogatari, but arsehole edition. And it's not even really that interesting or banterish. I mean, Monogatari is verbose and very conversational, but it's usually based on a bit of a frank give and take of sort of opinion, but also just like enjoyable, like bantery Nisio-issiness. Whereas this is just unrelentingly arsehole-ish and kind of just gives characters a lot of free reign to be pricks and not really like I feel like at any time Hachiman just really should have just been punched in the face, and that could have been the end of the volume of like, whoops, I went to hospital. Okay, done. And that's the end of it because I was, I had a broken nose. It's, just a singularly unpleasant character to hang with and have to look through the eyes of because it's so unrepentant and kind of revels in its real, like, I forget the word, but misanthropic point of view. And it's just really tiresome because it's not amusing. Like, characters don't really seem to get comeuppance. And also Yukino, like, initially seems like she's the more sensible character, but then it becomes very apparent that, oh no, she's an arsehole too. Like, you could have left that to be like a reveal of some kind, but no, after a while I feel like the author couldn't really handle it and just decided to let it all hang out and have her be the unholy prick she also is. And also and as a final thing before I hand over to you, Andy, the whole thing also just feels extremely light novelish, if that makes sense, where everything is convenient and sort of paced out and stepped, and you can kind of see everything from a mile away, but also it lives in this sort of charmed existence of living in the light novel universe where, certain structures exist and people kind of live at the whim of the author and they always play into their sort of smart, smarmy, like story they want to tell you, or like their sort of structure. Like, there's tons and tons of otaku references, like there's tons of stuff like that, which it just feels exhausting, really, especially when the teacher has it and it just turns into like dunking on the teacher and calling her old, and it's like, okay, that's been done before. It feels like what was that other light novel where that guy went to a club with two hot girls and he ended up having this harem that he spent the entire time running away from? I forget.
Is that Oh, okay, yeah. I was also gonna say Saikano How to Raise a Boring Girlfriend, which has a lot of the same problems. Yeah,
it's just singularly unpleasant. Like, the characters just aren't pleasant, and whenever there is like a moment where like you feel like the author is trying to like rehabilitate them, you're just like, no, this is manipulative. Fuck off. Like, I can see this from a mile away, and I can see what you're doing, and it's not going to work on me because I don't like any of these characters, and also I just don't like the writing style. It just seems like if there was one thing I could say about this series to sum up, it's highly masturbatory. Like, the whole series, I just wanted to be making a slow motion jerk off motion because that's just how it felt when I was reading it. But yeah, that's kind of I kind of flew off the handle there. Apologies. But yeah, that's kind of the series in a nutshell. And even the characters it introduces, like, either sidelines because they're too nice or they become an arsehole as well, like Yui, who kind of turns up and then ends up just like kind of weirdly entering their orbit forevermore. And she clearly has some kind of emotional stopgap or problem, but of course it's not going to return to that because it's got to do light novel hijinks. Fuck you. Here's a tennis match, which was shit. But anyway, Andy, how about you? What did you think of this series?
Yeah, I think you basically summed up all of my thoughts on it. I hated this series. Like, this is probably the worst thing that I've had to read for this podcast.
Really?
I hate all of the main characters. I hate all of their interactions with one another. I hate all the lazy Ataki references of like, oh, look, I put a Gundam name into this sentence. Like, well done.
But also, sorry, Andy, but also what it does, it will constantly point out the reference and go, so that makes it even worse, frankly, from my point of view.
And specifically, like, having come off the back of, for our bonus episode, reading Kizumonogatari again, which also has, like, Ataki references in it, but placed in a far more kind of entertaining and engaging way that also you don't need to engage with at all if you don't get the reference. In fact, sometimes that's the joke. Whereas this is a very clear, like, you know, it's almost a kind of testing your power level kind of thing of like, well, if you don't get this joke, then, you know, you don't belong in kind of reading this light novel. Which is always a really frustrating kind of like gatekeeping-y way of writing of just like, well, you need to get all these references I'm putting in or, you know, you don't belong here. But yeah, like I also hate how a lot of these story arcs are basically, they're kind of resolved by Hachiman kind of pulling out some kind of like hallmark greeting card solution to the problem and then kind of everybody being astounded at his insightful, wonderful solution to the problem when, like, there's nothing particularly smart or special about it. It's just like a really kind of saccharine or kind of surface level fix to whatever the service club is supposed to be resolving. Like, there's no kind of compelling or interesting payoff to the story arcs in this book. They're all just like really lazily kind of just dumped in at the end of just like, well, I guess I'd better fix this problem now. Here's some trite way of doing it. And like all of that stuff on top of everything else is just like, it just feels like another kick to the nether regions from a book that seems absolutely kind of utterly focused on kicking anyone and everyone in the nether regions as often as humanly possible.
Yeah. I mean, especially like, as you mentioned, like the resolutions to its stories or its like story arcs, especially with like the first one, I think the one with Yui who wants to learn how to bake cookies. Like, it doesn't resolve the core issue, which is, why is she baking these cookies? Why is she obsessed with this? Why does she keep being so self-deprecating? And it doesn't resolve it at all. Like, it doesn't even touch it. It forgets about it halfway through. And also the fact is that, and also the resolution it chooses to kind of close out the storyline and have, you know, Hachiman proved right. Ha, look at me. I did the smart thing. Like, that's the sort of resolution that would normally be preferred in like the second act of like a story and then discarded because it was too stupid. And then they'd move on to the real solution, getting at the actual core of the issue and having some emotional payoff and resolution. But no, in this case, they like kind of just do this stupid trite resolution and then end up with another character kind of hanging around because, again, her emotional sort of like chains are not taken off yet. And she's just going to be another piece of eye candy, like floating around and just like really crudely abused by all the characters, like being called a slut constantly. It's like, fuck off. Like, it's like, as you say, like, as you said, like the characters are all terrible. Even the ones who are like shit upon kind of deserve it. I mean, Yui perhaps less so, but even so, like, get away from these weirdos. They're just being harmful. All of it is caricatured. Like, all the characters are caricatures, and it makes it very tiresome because there's nothing interesting to really get invested in. Like, I mean, even, you know, again, like Monogatari series, a lot of the characters are caricatures. Like, they're kind of wild. You know, you've got characters who are like they are Nisio Issing characters whose names are a play on words, and they are very cleanly tied to their storyline. But you can still get involved and interested in what they're doing and their plight, and that's why you kind of keep reading it, and that's why. Even though, you know, especially because the comparison is direct here, where you have Araragi being, oh no, I don't want to get close to people. I'll lower my intensity as a human. Meanwhile, Hachiman seems to take that as an idea and actually just say, no, I'm going to be a prick. Loners for life. And it's like, oh, fuck off, dude. Like, no, it's just not interesting. And it, as I say, it makes it very tiresome to read because it's just so wretched to have to live in this guy's head and see what he's doing and also see the rest of the characters like dance around in front of him and they're all arseholes as well. And it just makes it very tiresome to read. It took me a long time because I just didn't like it. Reading it took me a long time because I didn't really want to like be with this group, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of burned through it quickly for basically the exact same reason of just like, I just wanted to be away from it as quickly as possible. I mean, I actually posted on Twitter that like, I wanted to set fire to this book even though it was on my tablet, and that was probably a bad idea. Because yeah, like it's so, and the point that very nearly just like pushed me away to the point of just saying like, I can't read this anymore, was the constant, like, calling Yui a slut. Like, it's, Hachiman's, like, incel stick throughout this volume is just, like, absolutely exhausting, and once Yui is on the scene, it just, like, ramps it up to 11 in a way that is really, really kind of impossibly uncomfortable to read. It's just, like, I mean, the note that I made around that point is just like, please just fire him into the sun, because it's like the only thing of value that you could do to that character at that point in time. And again, like that maybe wouldn't be so bad if he got his comeuppance, even to like a limited extent. There'd be some sort of catharsis for the reader of just like, okay, well, you know, I've had to sit through this character being a joke for 100 pages, but now, like, you know, he's seen the error of his ways, or like, you know, something has happened to maybe shake him out of that whole thing. But like, nothing does. Like, if anything, all the stuff that happens around him just like reinforces his behavior, and it just like makes it all the more frustrating as a result.
Yeah, I mean, even at the end of the end of the volume, tension and like conflict is resolved by Hachiman, and it's really weird where like characters are just like, oh, don't worry, he'll take care of it, and it's like, on what basis do you decide that like he's suddenly a dependable person who will do something? Like, this guy is an absolute arsehole, and like I think you definitely nailed it with, I think I actually have it written in my notes that like he is basically some kind of weird like incel poster child. I mean, the phrase "thank God" has fallen off in favor and stopped being used quite so much, because I think a lot of it kind of warped and like became far too real, frankly. Like, once you had people making manifestos around it and actually doing like school shootings or shooting up places, it became too real to exist, really, and everyone kind of like swiftly like tried to forget that incels were a thing that existed and people self-identified as. But he is flat out like a 4chan incel, someone who just revels in that like self-imposed garbage and does not let up on the throttle for 1 second. Which, if anything, just makes it more painful, because like I've known people like that, and it's fucking intolerable. So to actually have to read the book where this character, like the prime mover, is a complete prick is very tiresome.
Yeah, and the other thing I kind of found myself sort of ruminating on after the fact is I feel like the author has perhaps like hung out with people, because I think like everybody who has kind of like, you know, friendships, we all have friends who we can kind of constantly push the buttons on, and like, you know, you have that kind of joshing, like, you know, and it does get kind of toxic when you actually break it down, but you all have those kind of friendships where you constantly poke fun of at one another and kind of do one another down in this kind of joshing, joking, like, especially when, like, you know, between guys, I think it happens a lot more. And I feel like this book tries to kind of recreate that, and just completely mishandles and misunderstands and misrepresents what that kind of friendship and that kind of relationship is like. A, because it just goes in that direction from the get-go, and like, that's not how that works. And B, it just like doesn't understand that, like, you can, and again, I guess this is another Monogatari comparison where you have a character like Senjo Gahara, who is like insulting to basically everybody at some point in time, but it is done with in a way that there is always like a sort of a kernel of kind of caring or understanding or some other emotion behind her words, no matter how barbed they are. And that kind of undertone is completely absent from all of the conversations and dialogue here. Like, when Hachiman calls Yui a slut, there's no kind of endearing undertone of like, this is just my way of saying you're cute. No, he's just calling her a slut because he hates like the fact that she's attractive, and that, you know, that she is attractive to other guys. And that's one of the things that's so exhausting. And I can kind of like try and pick this apart and see perhaps what the author was trying to do, but just gets it wrong so spectacularly. Like, it's almost like an alien trying to write human relationships at some point. Yeah, well, you know, that's how 4chaners come across sometimes, because they're so shut off from social connections. But yeah, agreed to
entirely. I mean, also there's an entire sort of like the back half introduces a highly androgynous character, who is male, but like presents very female, just because they're small and cute and yada, yada, yada. Like the same shit that was done in Haganai and this exact same shit done in this, but like in an even more slavishly exhausting, like just gross way where, the whole thing might as well just have a giant like stamp of no homo on it, which is just kind of shit and lazy. And I'm kind of conscious I don't want to just spend the entire time dunking on the series, but there's just so much to dislike about it. Like as mentioned, the otaku bait sort of reference humor, which is barely humorous. The weird fan servicey parts where it like just. Whatever. We talked about Kizumonogatari, the series with the like 4-page panty shot description, but that also like is in the moment and afterwards fully aware of what that is and uses it to effect in the storyline. Whereas this is just like staring down someone's cleavage and then calling them a slut because why the fuck not? And it's that sort of thing that makes it entirely charmless. And like as mentioned, the reference is also just really grating because it will have this thing where it's almost like a knowledge check where passing it then laughs at you as well and goes, oh, you knew about that, nerd. So fuck off. And also it also tries doing this sort of laying down groundwork for future possible conflict where, there's possibly some history between Yui and Hachiman. Oh, I wonder what will become of that. And it's like, fuck off. You don't deserve this. Like, the author, don't deserve to try and sneak this stupid storyline in, which you're going to pay off in a future volume because it's lame and you don't deserve it and all the characters are awful. So... Yeah,
and I mean, I watched all of like the first season of the anime for review way back in the day, and like if there is one kind of glimmer of positivity I can say is that like I recall from that first season that some of the rough edges get knocked off of the characters, but like it was way too late for me to be invested in them by then. Like I already hated them so much that like it doesn't matter unless you chipped them down to absolutely nothing. Like there was nothing that was going to kind of redeem it for me. But like I guess if you are less completely turned off the series by this first volume, then like it did by all accounts seem to go on an upward trajectory from that point, but like that's slim pickings for me given kind of my feelings on the characters and the series at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some people who have like mentioned this series or are fans of it have said, oh yeah, the first volume is a bit of a hard read, and it's like, for me, this would go beyond a hard read into like a severe no, partially just because I don't trust the author or the characters to be redeemed or redeemable in any way. And also, frankly, I've only got so much time for reading light novels. And if I'm going to read a light novel, I'd rather read a good one. And thanks to the sheer plethora of light novels now available and J Novel Club making a bunch available for the month, there's more than enough that I can go and read right now. So I don't think I'm going to continue with this, even if people do say that it apparently improves. But at the same time, like, I just don't trust the author and I don't like the characters and I don't really want to see them get their comeuppance. I don't want to see them get redeemed in any way because I feel like it's just be punched in the face, most of them. Like, it's just so unremittingly awful.
And it's crazy when that kind of feeling even extends to like the teacher character in this volume. I mean, like you say, the teacher kind of gets dunked on a bit, but the teacher is also kind of an irredeemable jerk to everybody. I mean, the kind of the inter-chapter kind of little kind of amarque, if you like, of this book is kind of the various characters having their sort of, kind of school, like, oh, this is my plan for the future kind of thing, like written on paper, and then you just get the teacher's snarky comments of why they'll never achieve anything, basically. And it's like, even the teacher is just being kind of an irredeemable jerk to everybody who just like doles out physical violence to characters, etc., etc. And it's just like, there's just nobody I can find in this series who I have any kind of inkling of sort of interest in or like for whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, part of me when reading those sections just thought, how did you get this far? Like, surely someone should have like pulled you up at some whatever. But yeah, it's just singularly unpleasant to really have to inhabit these characters, and especially Hachiman, who is, as mentioned before multiple times, a complete and utter write-off. So yeah, and also, as I say, like the sheer sort of like smugness in the prose made it very tiresome to read. Like, I don't think it was just them writing a character, but I think it was like the author thinking themselves smart in what they were doing. Like, because even away from like Hachiman self-congratulating himself constantly, just the actual like writing itself was not enjoyable to read. So, you know, even if it was a well-written character story about a terrible character, maybe that'd be interesting. Or, I mean, hell, like the Decapitation series by Nisio Isin, another Nisio Isin banger, the main character is pretty objectionable, but it handles that stuff really well, and it knows where it exists, and it knows what it can get away with you as the reader, whereas this is just irredeemable arsehole circus. So yeah, and also, frankly, like, it's going to sound really minor, but also the light novel illustrations are kind of whatever. Like, a lot of them are just weirdly sort of flat shaded, like weird, like felt doll fan service, and so fuck off. Like, it's just, they're also no good. They look like felt dolls with really fucked up proportions.
Yeah, which is kind of a shame, actually, because, again, there's one thing that I do like about this. I actually quite like the character designs for the main characters, but yeah, I agree that the illustrations therein are not really particularly great. Like, I feel like, again, from watching the anime, it's like, oh yeah, like, these characters, you know, look good. Like, they have, they're identifiable, like, you know, they kind of have something to them, but, yeah, again, slim pickings when it's just like, I quite like the character designs.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm glad I read it in a weird way, mostly because I can kind of put this behind me and not have to worry about this franchise ever again. So yeah, that was my youth romantic comedy as wrong as I expected, the light novel version.
Yeah, and I mean, likewise here, like having watched the anime and kind of bounced off of it pretty hard. Like, I've had a lot of people like, how can you not like that? Like, maybe you should read the source material and then you'll understand. And it's like, well, I have now, and I definitely understand that I hate this series. So
yeah. I mean, yeah, there's so much other stuff I want to read instead that I'm just going to go do that. Fuck it. So, yeah, that's my youth romantic comedy as wrong as I expected. So, yeah. Okay, so moving on to our next title for today's episode is Andy's pick. Take it away, Andy.
Yeah, so my pick for this series is kind of a nice confluence of events, because not only has the first volume of the manga been released in English recently, the anime adaptation has also started as well. So very much on the pulse of goings on currently. And so my pick for this show is Kakushigoto, Volume 1, which is the latest series from Koji Kameta, who you may know from such works as Sayonara Zetsubo Sensei and Joshiraku, both series that well, like Zetsubo Sensei in anime and manga form, I really enjoyed, and Joshiraku, the manga has never been localized as far as I'm aware, but the anime is a banger. So I'm a big sucker for Koji Kameta's take on things, and so I was very excited to have another work of his to delve into, especially in 2020, because it kind of feels like it's been a while. And so Kakushigoto, in typical Koji Kameta style, like the title itself is kind of a bit of wordplay. It has a double meaning. On the one hand, it means a secret or hiding something, but it can also be written to mean that drawing is my job. And so Kakushigoto is the story of a character called Kakushigoto, who is a manga artist who draws ecchi manga, basically. Not full on porn stuff, but very kind of fan servicey, blah 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 kind of stuff.
Yeah, think Ken Akamatsu kind of.
Yeah, pretty much. Maybe a little bit kind of south of that as well, but definitely in that ballpark. And so given that he has a relatively young daughter, he's decided that he wants to keep that a secret from her. He doesn't want her knowing about what he does for a living. And so every morning when he leaves for work, he leaves in his business suit and tie with a briefcase, etc., sees her off to school, and then heads to like a local clothes shop to basically do a reverse Mr. Ben, as I called it on another podcast, to turn into his casual clothes and then head to his manga studio to work on whatever he's working on. And beyond that, this is a really typical kind of Koji Kameta thing, that it's really just kind of finding a topic to kind of dig into and mine for humor. And in this case, it always kind of revolves around either Goto just kind of like doting on his daughter or trying to kind of keep his work a secret from her in some shape or form in ways that kind of escalate for comedy fashion. Whether it's his editor kind of visiting his house in a t-shirt, emblazoned with the main character from the series he's working on, through to trying to see how she's getting on her kind of school summer camp and things going in some crazy directions from there. And I will say, like, in comparison, I think to Zetsubo Sensei in particular, as the other one I've read in manga form, like, this feels like a slightly more kind of forced setup for Keiji Komeita's kind of way of doing things compared to those series. Like, I feel like Zetsubo Sensei has a really effortless kind of plot and concept to kind of get into the meat and bone of just like finding topics to poke fun at and find comedy from. Whereas this has to do a lot more kind of legwork, particularly in its first chapter or two, to really kind of set up the characters and the premise and what's going on. But I feel like once it gets there, it kind of gets into a decent groove. Like there are some good, entertaining, amusing things throughout this volume. Like it got a few decent kind of chuckles out of me. Yeah, like there's nothing really kind of massively sort of outstanding about it, but I was entertained by it. Like I kind of like Komeita's art style. Like it kind of works here as well. Again, maybe not quite as well as Zetsubo Sensei. I feel like the author is now at the point where they've kind of recognized they're old enough that they probably shouldn't try and leverage too many pop culture references. So that kind of gets left at the door for the most part, although I was not expecting to read a reference to SMAP in 2020. But for the most part, like I feel like he's tried to kind of go on the straight and narrow and not get too deep into kind of current events and politics, etc., which is the kind of thing that has meant that Sano Zetsubo Sensei is kind of aged quite dramatically now, because it has a lot of references to very of the moment things that people have probably forgotten about or know nothing about at this point. And so this kind of tries to keep it mostly to just a far more kind of standard comedy fare. But yeah, like I liked it. Like I had a good time reading through this. I had fun. If it wasn't for the fact that this volume was so godly expensive on Comixology, I'd say like I'm definitely on board to read more of it. But man, like this was like $10.99, which I don't mean to beef about prices, but that seemed like a lot for a single volume of manga. But yeah, like that aside, I enjoyed it. Like it was definitely in my wheelhouse, and as somebody who is a fan of this person's previous works, it kind of hit maybe not all of the same buttons that I was hoping it would, but it hit a decent amount of them to the point where I was satisfied.
Yeah. As a first, I have so many things I want to pick about there, but the first thing I say about the price thing is, yeah, $10.99 is a lot for digital, and it's a normal size, like 180 page volume, which I initially, I'll get to that, but I bought it on Kobo, which was slightly cheaper, but still £7 plus. So that was a bit of a shock. Especially because, so I like this series. I liked what I've read, but also I don't want to read any more of it. Partially because it has density. Like I feel like Koji Kumita has like relaxed slightly. Now he has kind of like, earlier when you said that you think that he's going to keep away from pop culture, which is sensible, especially because some of the stuff in Zetsubo Sensei was basically like week old political commentary on very particular scandals, and it's like, whoa, that'll age badly, and it did, because it aged even before the manga came out here. But I think he's mellowed a bit, where he's not quite as intense, but at the same time, the series is still extremely dense, with its material. And because the series is actually bookended with like a 18-year-old version of, Hime, Kagushi's, daughter, Hime Goto. I'm sure Hime Goto is actually a wordplay. I just haven't figured it out yet. But like it's bookended by Hime being given a key and finding out that, her father was, or is a ecchi manga artist, which then just raises more questions about, what happened to him? Why'd they give her the key? Did he manage to actually keep it secret for 8 whole years then? What the hell? Cause it's mostly scheduled when she's like a 10-year-old, and a very spacey 10-year-old at that. And like, there's so much I want to like about this series, but it's also extremely tiring. Like, I feel like I said that a lot in this episode between, Origairu and this, but when I first started reading it, the sheer density of it made me think, oh, this is a jumbo-sized volume. It's a one-shot. This is going to be a one-shot thing. And then I found out that there's 11 volumes in Japan, and I'm just like, no fucking way. Because although I like the jokes and I like the humor and I like the sort of setup, and I think that one thing it definitely does better than Zetsubo Sensei is it actually sets out its stall of what the boundaries of its world are. Like, I feel like, Joshiraku did it as well, where it's about these characters in this setting and sometimes they'll venture out, whereas Zetsubo Sensei went fully nuts and just ranged around everywhere. It had so many characters, and while the initial setup was very straightforward, it quickly got really hard to parse and keep it all in your head when you had so many characters and all of them look kind of the same or just have certain, like the main character, Zetsubo Sensei himself, being one of 3 brothers, all who wear glasses and have the same hair. Like, even the author took the piss out of that in future works, like in Joshiraku. But like, I mean, the setup for this is, as you say, the first chapter has to set it up, but that's like 8 pages because it's so dense. Like, it's intensely dense in its setup and it gets a lot across, and the sheer amount of jokes per page is high. So it has tons of stuff going on. But for me, in general, is that halfway through this volume, either me or the volume or my reception to it kind of just let it all hang out a bit. Like, I feel like it went from being this very taut, very exacting, like, awesome semi-autobiographical story about hiding your shameful job, turned into a long form thing about being a manga artist and also being a dad and also being a bit of an idiot. And it kind of just went a bit flat. It went slightly looser. Like, it seemed to relax. And then I'm like, oh, this felt like a very sharp, very strong, very well-pointed one-shot, and now it's become an ongoing series, and I'm kind of less cool with that because I don't really want this hanging around for N+1 volumes. And now, again, 11 volumes, like, I'm sure there's a way to, like, drag this stick out for that long, but I'm not interested, mostly because most of the stuff that it's been picking up as storylines, like Kakushigoto himself, like, weirdly accidentally hitting on ladies and setting up even more stupid situations, which are funny, and the comedy is there and it works, but it's not what I'm looking for with this premise, or just with what has been initially set out. Like, I was wanting, it felt like it was setting up a one volume series, and now it's like off. I know I keep repeating myself, but yeah, it was just a case of like, oh, this is more than I want of this setup, like, at all. And also how sharp it was to start with, and then starts to get a bit, like, it starts to fade out and blur as it continues, like with the, assistants that Kakushi has, who also themselves are weird gags, and everyone of course has a weird gag pun name, and you know, I feel like it's definitely a evolution and like enhancement of Kumita's art and his sort of sensibility. But at the same time, there's loads of stuff that's really weird. Like, you know, Hime Goto as an 18-year-old constantly has her skirt on the verge of giving her a panty shot, which is tiresome and dumb. But yeah, it's just, I just kind of got exhausted by the sheer amount of it by the end. And while I loved my time with it, and I especially loved the little side note and omake about being a manga author and what things he's kind of put in the story that is actually like true, or ripped from his own life, which includes some stuff that you think, wow, you probably shouldn't tell people that you drew in the nude, guy. Like, that's weird. But it worked, but at the same time, I don't really want any more of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think to frame it kind of a slightly different way from kind of like my take on it is the series feels like it goes from being stand-up comedy to sitcom. Like,
totally.
The early chapters of this are very much the kind of like, what's the deal with airplane food of manga, which again is a very Koji Komeita thing of just like finding a topic and just kind of riffing on it. But yeah, like at some point it starts to feel more like a sitcom once it brings in all of his assistants and you have the whole kind of like, you know, camping trip kind of thing. Like suddenly it goes into sitcom territory of like, here's a scenario rather than kind of a topic to riff upon. And I mean, for my part, like I kind of enjoyed both in different ways, and I'm certainly not coming to this series and I won't kind of I won't stick with it for like the deeper narrative or anything that kind of happens. Like I'm very much just there for the hijinks and whatever dumb jokes come along. But yeah, like I can kind of see why that is potentially off-putting. Like, and I think it's the thing that, you know, Zetsubo Sensei and Joshiraku both, again, is kind of what I mean about this series having kind of a more sort of torturous setup in that sense, because Zetsubo Sensei and Joshiraku are both very simple. Like, here's an excuse to throw these characters together on a regular basis where they're just going to shoot the breeze, and then I can just run with this and use this as an excuse to make jokes about stuff. Whereas this, by its very nature, has a feeling that it has to have kind of progression, and it has to move around, and it has to have kind of scenery and settings and locations in a way that Kumeta's other works don't, because they could easily have just been people stood in front of a completely white background and it really wouldn't have mattered 90% of the time.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's also why the like frame story around the start and end of the volume comes across as so weird, because, as I say, it set itself up as a beginning point and an end point with this like hiding job from daughter thing, but also has now turned it into this long form, as you say, serialized storyline with loads of characters getting dragged into it. And it just gives it gives the series a mythology it really doesn't need, or I really want to see, honestly, which kind of distracts from it, because like so many of the jokes and so many of the bits are so interesting or just really fascinating. Like, the art, when Kikuchi gets noticed as a manga artist, they ask him to draw Precure or Precure. And it turns into this weird long running joke where he's like, man, stop asking me to draw stuff that is not even mine. Like, what the fuck? That was kind of interesting as like a gag. But as you say, it kind of turns from a single stand-up thing to an ongoing smeared out storyline, like when they go to the beach. And while there are good jokes there, you don't need a frame story to stand up a bunch of people going to a beach and doing stupid shit. That's perfectly fine. You can have that. But yeah, one thing I want to mention though, for sure, that I really loved about this series was, I mean, Kumeta has his very striking art style, but I feel like something that has really developed and really shone in this volume was the use of paneling. Like, there's some really fascinating use of subdividing the page and showing motion, and like having like swooping sort of panel sets across the page that like follow the characters. Like, even the second page alone with Hime walking up some stairs is an amazing use of panel separation, where you can see the stairs are outlined by the edge of the panel frame, and you've got one copy of the character walking towards you and one walking up the stairs, and the stairs themselves are part of the panel edge. Like, that's, I mean, obviously explaining a visual medium in a podcast is fucking dumb, so apologies everyone, but like, that sort of stuff is my catnip, because I love it. I love it when people go nuts with the format of having a page to play with. And like, Komata, like, again, already has like really striking, like, monochromatic art, even makes a screen tone joke, which, as a member of a podcast called Screentone Club, I am totally down with. So that was great. But all that stuff with like playing with the page and the characters made it was catnip to me, frankly. That sort of stuff like showed how much Kumeta like wanted to kind of have fun with his characters, and also like, you know, the constant powerful light and shade and people, like, you know, and also lots of good faces as a result. So yeah, some really good artwork in this that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and I feel like that's definitely, a sense, there's definitely a sense of growth for that. I mean, it's been a long time since I read Zetsubo Sensei, but I seem to recall that being pretty kind of, pretty staid and sort of by the numbers in terms of its paneling, etc. It was functional, it was good enough, but I don't recall there being anything particularly striking about it. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to see him develop now that things have calmed down for him.
Yeah, which is also an interesting part of it, because he says like, oh yeah, they even make a reference to like people saying, oh, you know, don't worry, things have relaxed, and they're like, that's an insult among manga authors. But that's the sort of stuff where, as I say, it feels like it turns from like, to use your reference point, like it feels like it turns from a stand-up, because it goes from being sharp jokes about authors, sharp jokes about assistants, sharp jokes to, oh, we can smear this all out a bit more across a longer storyline, which is still good, but not what I'm looking for. I feel like that's the main thing I'll say about it. And also, frankly, like the increased cost of this volume made me think, oh, this is going to be like a one shot. And then when I was halfway through it, I thought, Christ, this is long. And I checked and I'm like, oh no, it's 180 pages. It's just, it's extremely dense. So it's a lot to get through.
Yeah. Like, I wonder if it's just like translation costs were such that they had to price it higher. Because, like I imagine this is a work that needs a lot of translation effort. But yeah, I mean, it is weird because, again, going back to Sayonara Zetsubou Sensei, like, I've not read every single volume of that series by any stretch. And, even the idea that it's currently 11 volumes, I can't imagine myself reading all of those. It definitely feels like there will be a point where I would fall off of this series. It's just that point isn't quite yet. I think even like that introductory kind of chapter that is like 18-year-old kind of Hime finally, getting the key to her dad's old studio. Like, I suspect, and again, having watched the anime adaptation thus far, I think that might literally have just been dropped in there initially because Koji Kometa wanted to like point out the wordplay in the title and be like, hey, look, I did a thing, here's the thing, isn't it funny? Because like watching that in Japanese with English subtitles, it really clearly like hammers home like, hey, look, here are the two meanings of Kakushigoto. And I suspect that's probably the only reason why it's there, but then by its very existence, it then suddenly turns into giving the series kind of a sense of, not so much deep lore, but of a kind of sense of like, hey, there's an end point to this that is many years in the future, and it kind of sets up this weird expectation that it then almost feels like it has to lean into itself of like, I've made this rod for my own back and I now need to kind of carry on through this across however many volumes of manga it takes.
Well, I think the main thing that kind of sold it for me or like sealed it was the fact that it I know I'm hammering on about this, I'm sorry. But it revisits at the end of the volume. Like it could have left the whole Hime finds the treasure trove of ecchi manga and does the wordplay. Like hell, the amount of people I saw who were watching the anime who took screenshots of that scene and then complained about it gave me a lot of joy, because who doesn't love a good bit of like groan worthy wordplay? But in the case of this series, like at the end of the first volume, it goes back to it and shows the like editor and one of the assistants. And I'm like, why are you doing this? Like, you don't need to, like I say, it's like it's setting up deep lore for the fucking manga author comedy series where he has hemorrhoids and just constantly has a donut cushion as a result, which does lead to some really good jokes. And yeah, as someone who has poked fun at someone's hemorrhoids before, I can get behind, frankly. So
yeah, and that is definitely the stuff that this volume does best. Like, absolutely. Like, I think it works much better when it just has free reign to just kind of like just run with an idea rather than kind of worry about any kind of setup or premise at all. But I don't know, like maybe Koji Kometa is just going to angle this and change it into a dark fantasy manga at some point. Who knows?
I did love that. That was great. But also, to continue your metaphor of stand-up versus serial, I feel like it would, if it did somehow change into like a sketch comedy, that would also be great. Like, I feel like that's one way it could very gracefully change, as if it's just a bunch of like Koji Kometa, like, I mean, hell, Zetsubou Sensei kind of did this, even though it had the whole like frame of the school. But it's just like, oh, here's the thing we're riffing on now. Da-da-da-da. You know, like, hell, that was basically how Zetsubou Sensei went. Like, there'll be two characters talking. Someone would say something like bald, and then it would be like 20 pages of riffing on bald people. And then that was kind of how that entire series worked.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of the strange thing about this, is that you could kind of see this being just like Goto and his assistants like working on manga, and that is just the setup, and then you have a perfect sketch show. But because it's added that extra element of the whole like, here's my daughter and you know, I'm keeping this a secret, it just adds an extra dimension to it, which, you know, I can totally see why he probably wanted to do that, but at the same time, yeah, potentially it does take away some of the kind of comedy purity of it, as it were. And yeah, like I don't know. I'm definitely, if it's not ridiculously expensive, I will definitely be buying future volumes. I'm definitely going to keep watching the anime adaptation, because that has already had some really good material from volume 2 that has kind of like sold me on it a little further. But yeah, like I totally see where you're coming from in terms of it feeling like a lot in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I might, if you're saying it gets into volume 2, then it must be covering a lot. But then again, so did Zetsubo Sensei the anime, like all 3 seasons of it, which I don't think we actually officially got in the West, did we? Because it got optioned by someone and they just let it rot, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Media Blasters picked it up and then did nothing with it.
They probably tried to translate it and went, oh, fuck.
I suspect that's exactly what happened. I think Discotech or somebody has picked up season 1 in the US now, and they are promising, no, we're really going to release it this time. So yeah, maybe we'll get to see that at some point, and thoughts and prayers with whoever is translating and subtitling that.
Yeah, goddamn. Yeah, because half of the streaming platforms on the internet at the moment would like shit a brick if they tried to do the typesetting for it.
Yeah, and Blu-ray subtitles are not the most versatile things. So yeah, best of luck to you.
No, I've heard bad things about them, unsurprisingly. But man, yeah. I mean, hell, like, thinking back on it, like, bloody Zetsubo Sensei and Penny Pony Dash both were, like, in this golden age of Shaft opening credit sequences that were just fucking amazing. Along with other series that are in that sort of pedigree. Maybe I'll watch the anime. Where is it streaming at the moment, then?
I don't think it is. I think it's still unavailable everywhere currently. So, yeah, like, pending some kind of home video release, I believe it is currently kind of off the boards in terms of legal viewing, sadly, because yeah, like you say, that is like a golden age of kind of early Shaft before they kind of blew up with Madoka, and also like for Zetsubo Sensei, kind of early Gekikan Inukari, who also did stuff on Madoka, so it's kind of weird times.
Yeah, very weird, man. When you said it's not streaming, I just slumped like 4 inches, like ugh.
Yeah, it's like it's a reminder of days of yore when like you couldn't watch every single thing ever,
like when we used to have an anime podcast.
Yeah.
Oh god, Jesus, a different lifetime. But yeah, that's kind of I feel like for both of these series, I've been weirdly het up about it and ready to like complain. But with Kakushigoto, I want to watch the anime to see where it goes. Like your mention of having interest in the second series or second volume has energized me. But yeah, I don't want to undersell it. Like I know I kind of went off on one, but the art really was fascinating to me. And also, again, one of the reasons why it took so long to bloody well read, because I was so like arrested by some of the pages of like, oh fuck, you did some really smart stuff on here. This is really cool. Even if it mostly exists to heighten the absurdity of Guy running home with a briefcase with a pillow in it so he can go and keep up this stupid pretense of not being a manga author. So yeah, good stuff. So, our next episode is likely going to be a reprise of looking at Manga Plus, 2 more series. But our next scheduled episode, we're going to be taking a look at, I've picked the manga version of Inspector. Yes, yes, the wordplay is again there. Also recently an anime, I believe.
Yes, indeed it was.
Okay, yeah. So I know nothing about this apart from like the little girl main character's hat. So I've picked up the manga to read that. So yeah. And Andy, how about you?
Yes, I'm continuing with my kind of ripped from the headlines picks, because this is another series that has had an anime adaptation just started, and this is volume 1 of Art. That's Art with an E on the end, because it's posh like that.
Yeah, I have had this sat in my like digital storefront like purchase list for about 6 months now. I keep meaning to read it, but it always ends up at the bottom of the pile. So finally, an excuse. Thank you, Andy. But yeah, enough one of the series is done by North Star Pictures. They have Wakako Zake fame. So there's that. Cool. So, moving into close down, thank you very much for listening. If you want to listen to more podcasts, you can go to our website, which is Screentone.club. Look in your podcast, add us to your podcast app of choice, whatever you want to do. If you do like the podcast, tell a friend. That stuff is still the best way for podcasts to grow and find new audiences. Tweet about it, that sort of good stuff. Ratings and reviews are always greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. And you can find us on Twitter at Screentone Club. You can email us at show@screentone.club. My name's Elliot Page. You can find me at Elliot Page on Twitter, going slightly mad from the lockdown. And you can also find me at questionable.systems, where I somehow have been hoodwinked into making video games. So we'll see how that goes. Andy, how about you?
Yeah, you can find pictures of my sweet fishing trophy from Animal Crossing at Hannah's 1979.
Oh, sorry. Video games equals fishing minigame, always. So, thank you very much for listening, and good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.